Thanks everyone for being here, and good evening. I'm Sharice Bach with Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon and Oregon Interfaith Power and Light. I'm the Creation Justice Advocate. And this is our fourth in our webinar series on creation justice, and we're excited to have Randy Woodley with us here tonight. I'll introduce him a little bit more later on, but wanted to welcome you all and thank you for being here tonight. As a way to become present here together and remind us of our connection to the creation around us and the God who placed us within it, I wondered if we could just take a few moments to reflect on the soil. So I wonder if you all would think about and reflect back on the soil of the land that you were raised on, the land where you grew up. And if you would put a couple of words in the chat about that soil. What do you remember about it? What color was it? What did it smell like? Reflect on the soil where you were raised. For me, the soil where I grew up was filled with clay. And I remember the really moist smell of playing in the creek near my house and digging in the clay. Some of the rest of you are saying it was cool and moist, dark, moist, and sandy. Raised in Brooklyn, where it's mostly concrete and keep off the grass signs. Nice. Crumbly, smelling of decomposed leaves. Rich, wet, decomposing leaves, fragrant. Fertile soil, some rocky in the hills of California. Moved around, so didn't maybe have a connection to the soil as much as others. Damp, sandy leaf litter. Clay, bark, lots of amendments necessary. Yeah. Suburban lawns. Thank you for sharing. And I'd like you to think now about and reflect on the soil where you live now, and reflect with gratitude on the land where you live and the way that it offers life to all of us and to the community of creation in which we live. So take a moment just to reflect on the soil where you live now and offer a prayer of gratitude and ask God to bless that land and that soil where you live now. Thank you. And as one more way to reflect on the soil and the land on which we live, I'd like us to just go around and say your name, introduce yourself, where you're coming from in the state, and acknowledge the keepers of that land, the native tribes that kept that land before we arrived and continue to steward it alongside us. So thank you all. Thanks for sharing and for being here. And for those of us who don't know the answer to that question as far as land acknowledgement, this is an opportunity for learning and an opportunity tonight to learn more about how we can pay attention to those kinds of questions and how they relate to our faith and our ability to care for creation justly in this moment. So the tribes that lived in my region are the Kalapuya, and I'm coming to you from Newberg, Oregon tonight. And I'm excited to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Randy Woodley, who is in the same county as me. I'll let you acknowledge tribes when you get to share with us. And Randy and I have been colleagues at Portland Seminary for the last several years. I teach in the Creation Care program there. And Randy is the director of intercultural and indigenous studies there, and teaches a range of different great classes. And I always love to have students that have been in his classes because they've learned such great, amazing things and So he's been a colleague I've really appreciated in the last many years that we have both worked there. And Randy also has a farm and learning center called Eloheh, and it's a farm and a seed bank, as well as a place for individuals and groups to come and learn. And so for over 30 years, the Woodleys, Randy and his wife Edith, have been teaching non-native and native peoples to deepen their commitment to preserving humanity's role as good earth keepers and understanding Creator's invitation to harmony and shalom. That's the goals of their Eloheh community. Randy does a lot of writing and has written a great book called Shalom and the Community of Creation. And that one has been really instrumental in my own visioning and ability to look at the world and the Bible in new and important ways. So I really appreciate that book. Living in Color is also a really helpful book that the subtitle is Embracing God's Path for Ethnic Diversity. And Randy has a children's book called The Harmony Tree that's really great. And then recently he co-wrote with Bo Sanders, Decolonizing Evangelicalism. So that's an important one to pick up. I haven't gotten a chance to read that one yet, but it sounds excellent. So I look forward to reading that and learning how we go about doing that important work better as we need to. And Bo and Randy also have a podcast called Piecing It All Together. So that's an exciting thing to check out if you want to hear more of Randy. And also, Randy is going to be starting a learning cohort called Community of Creation Learning Cohort, From Cultural Collapse to Re-inhabitation. And that will be a 4-month-long learning cohort that will be mostly virtual with a little bit of socially distanced in-person learning. And that's going to be in partnership with Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. So we'll be sending out information about how to join that learning cohort soon. So lots of great ways to get connected with Randy's work and learn more about his teaching and his insights and wisdom. So with that said, I will hand it over to Randy to share with us tonight about Eloheh and creation justice in Oregon and beyond.
Thanks, Therese. Appreciate the introduction, but I'm doing so many things, I'm tired already now after you listed them. So thank you all for hanging out tonight. I'll try to make this interesting. There's like way more about what's going on in climate change than I can begin to talk about tonight. So I'm just gonna sort of hit on a few themes, but I'm gonna give you a map for tonight. I'm gonna give you a PowerPoint presentation in just a moment. And then we'll have some time to dialogue after that. Hopefully a lot of time to dialogue. So write down questions that you might have along the way. I think one really good question is all we really need. So if you write down a really good question, we can go from there. But hopefully we'll have several being asked, several good questions. Yeah, let me give you a map. The map is this, that there's a connection between how we treat people and how we treat the environment. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that there is no difference because we are all part of that environment. So that's your map. But thank you for hanging out. I'm going to go ahead and get started on a PowerPoint. I'll try to make this as brief as possible. I'm guessing we have an hour and an hour and a half altogether, right? So we got about an hour and 10 minutes. So I want to be able to get this done in, let's say, 35 to 40 minutes so we can have maximum time to dialogue. So, so that will be about 7:05, and I'll start watching for that. You know what? I don't have my phone with me. So somebody throw up in the chat 7:05 when it's 7:05. Okay, thanks. Let me share with you at least one Indigenous perspective. This is something that we have been talking about for many years. Back in 1999, I think it is when I started keeping track of what was going on with the climate. I remember, watching this thing where, tornadoes were becoming more and more, it seemed increasingly, hurricanes and, flooding and fires. And this was before it became a common knowledge. But I just had the suspicion something was going on, and a few people were talking about it. So I started keeping track, and it really began to awaken me to the fact that this is a time like no other in our history, and that we need to do something about it. And so we've been talking about this ever since, but now it is something that a lot of people talk about, and so we're happy about that, and we're starting to get more people actually listen to us. So recognizing the Yaml and Tualatin bands of the Kalapuya, who are in this area right here, Yaml, Yam Hill as we call it. We always try to make these things sound English, or like the Willamette. It's really the Willamette, which means the waterfall or spill water. But I acknowledge that this is the land that I am settled on, and the Kalapuya are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Round. So let's talk about, I use this term, the community of creation, a lot. And when I say that, I also mean human beings. And I mean every living creature, every rock, everything that has life and breath. So in a Ketua tradition, which is my tribe, I'm a legal descendant of the United Ketua Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma. Our tradition says that our role as human beings is to maintain harmony and balance in creation. That's our job. We have the privilege of co-sustaining all of creation with Creator and the earth and all creatures contributing. Our Cherokee word to describe that is Eloheh. Eloheh means basically abundance, peace, security. It means that nobody's hungry. It means our history, our culture, and all of these things. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but it's much like the Hebrew word shalom in the scriptures. Also, in the Christian story, or in the Genesis story, human beings are created last, not to rule, but to fill the need to co-sustain. Not as the crown of glory, as some teach, but as the only creatures uniquely equipped to co-sustain the rest of creation. Responsibility, not privilege. So not over the land, but serving and preserving God's creation. And so this, I see very much, is what these two traditions have in common. And both traditions, to be a co-sustainer in the community of creation, is foundationally what it means to be human. In our relationship with creation, nature exists for itself, or perhaps some might say Creator's pleasure, or perhaps simply for life to continue. Nature is enduring. Each of us are here, but for a brief moment. Our pleasure and our needs are a surprisingly wonderful byproduct of our role to co-sustain creation, but they are not the prime product. We just have the benefits that go along with being co-sustainers. It follows then to remake the creation in our own design may, in many cases, be vain attempts at idolatry. To willfully damage creation, I would call sacrilege, and to take pleasure in damaging it is sadistic. So I want you to think about the place that I'm talking about. There's deforestation, widespread deforestation. Topsoil is depleted, oceans and bays are polluted and fished out, rivers and streams are undrinkable, air pollution makes breathing unhealthy, disease kills tens of thousands, large mammals are going extinct, classism reigns via gender, wealth, and race, cities are overcrowded, majority of people are living in poverty, corruption and greed run rampant, injustice is the norm except for the top 1%, and hunger, disease, war, and economic depression are ever present. So what is that place? If you're with somebody, say it out loud, take your guess. And if you guessed that it's the Western Europe late Middle Ages, then you are correct. You win. Because that's exactly what was happening at the time just before and at the time of quote unquote discovery. So, you know, all the oak forests were being cut down. Only the kings and nobles had, in much of Europe, had those protected. They were being cut down to make castles and forts, and iron tools were being made from the heat from the oaks, especially. And it was just a mess. And that's what was going on at that time. And now the same thing is beginning to happen here. And the commonality, I would say, is the Western worldview. In a Western worldview, the nature of the relationship with the land has changed over time. It's not an indigenous worldview. And you know, we go into great lengths to talk about, you know, how we got this from Platonic dualism from Greece and through Rome and Britain and now America, the United States, and why empires have to sort of globalize and steal capital from other places and all that sort of thing. But just to know that at one time, people in these nations were indigenous and had an indigenous perspective. But the relationships now have changed over time, and also between farmers and food workers. It's a more commodified now. The central focus is commodification. So this capitalistic ethic has consequences. There's a corollary between how European Americans treat creation and how they treat people. And I would say especially women. Think about that. What's the predominant patriarchal and heteropatriarchal view of women? And what is the same view of land? To control it, to objectify, to expect production, to exploit, to serve at one's pleasure, and rape culture. And I would say rape culture among women and rape culture among the earth. There's a lot of corollaries there. The symptoms of the crisis are short-term profiteering, global expansion, and an American value of convenience, all resulting from a deranged Western worldview and causing destruction of the earth. They say we're experiencing the Anthropocene. I don't think that's true. I think what we're really experiencing is what I call the Europatricene. Jarius Grove says, it was a European elite that developed a distinctively mechanistic view of matter, an oppositional relationship to nature, and an economic system indebted to geographical expansion. The resulting political orders measured success by how much wealth could be generated in the exploitation of people and resources. The geological record bears the mark of this European assemblage of hierarchies. Understanding the forces of Europeanization, the forces of racial superiority, economic hegemony, and global resettlement is essential to understanding how the planet got to this point. This is probably the wisest thing that will be said tonight. I call the Western worldview a failed experiment. I don't think it's done the earth any good, and it hasn't even done the world much good. And that could be argued. How do we get there? What are the giant steps that are taken to gain access to cheap food, which is what we're looking for, right, as a country? To reinforce a worldview and faith that allows actual cultural, economic, and legislative genocide on indigenous peoples and cultures, and then whitewash the history of that. to steal indigenous people's land through fraudulent treaties, unjust laws, use of force, and commodify their lands and water. To enslave indigenous people, then as they succumb to disease, import West Africans to replace them and structure slavery into society. To use Africans, Chinese, Irish, and all the others to produce food for the corporate man, and to incentivize and globalize the system or parts of the system. So what is happening? Same thing. Topsoil's disappearing, forests are shrinking, desertification is advancing, coral reefs are dying, plants, fish, insects, birds, and animals are all going extinct. It is very sad, very sad. And yet indigenous people have lived here for 24,000 plus years without endangering the land. And here's just a very quick timeline perspective. I usually have all the things laid out in the same time as other things that are going on around the world, but I didn't want to take the time to do that tonight. But we learn about ancient Greece, China, Egypt, etc. But what about ancient American history? Did you know great civilizations thrived in the Americas with unparalleled techniques and all of these things? Microagriculture and macro environmental management, sustainable architecture, humanities, sciences, urban planning, democratic governments, education systems, intercontinental trade, complex peacemaking strategies, all of these kinds of things that we say are part of a civilized society were all a part of the Americas in what we call prehistory. And again, there's a whole section of teaching on the great places and the mound building cultures and the Chaco Canyons and all the rest all across the Americas, and that are so astounding that often we see them on TV and they're saying aliens had to do this because native people couldn't have done this. There was really a civilization here. I would argue that ancient American civilizations were much healthier than European, both personally and environmentally. They were more tolerant of cultural and religious diversity. All the medicines, at least 500 medicines and herbal remedies are used in our modern medicines today. 60% of the world's foods that are eaten right now originated in the Americas. These are all things that we've grown, by the way, in these pictures. And you can see a whole list of some of these down here on the bottom. But let's talk about the Pacific Northwest. I want to be very local specific. Ancient Pacific Northwest Columbian Basin peoples devised complex systems of clans and societies that are considered ingenious today. Their art is unique from all other indigenous peoples. The coastal tribes supported the most dense population of any other area in North America. This is really important for us because we live in the same land. It's estimated that in 1491, the greater Pacific Northwest supported about 1/3 of the indigenous population of the Americas. If correct, that could mean between 20 and 60 million people. Then a 6,000-year-old record shows that up until the past 2 centuries, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest never suffered from drought conditions. Theirs were societies of abundance, not need. This is the land that we live on. Then came expansion. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but it's here for you if you need it. There's lots of things to say about the Lewis and Clark expedition and what happened as a result, and the Oregon Trail, but I just have a couple quotes. Here's one from a white settler during the Rogue Indian War. The Indians are ignorant, abject, and debased by nature, whose minds are as incapable of instruction as their bodies are of labor. They have nothing in common with humanity but the form, and God has sent us to destroy them as he did to the Israelites of old, to similar tribes. And this, by the way, attitude went from the top down. I mean, I have quotes by Henry Clay and, of course, Andrew Jackson, and all kinds of folks that make similar claims. So this was the atmosphere about this time of the Oregon Trail. It was all calculated. This is a letter in the Indiana Historical Society from President Jefferson to William Henry Harrison, 1803. So not long before the Oregon, the expedition of Lewis and Clark. And basically what they say is like, they have land and we want their land. And so let's push trading and let's get them in debt. And when it gets beyond what they can pay, we will take different parts of their land. So this was all and then they either have to incorporate or be removed. So this is a calculated plan. Here are the original people's map of Oregon, and here is what they are down to today. Oregon came to be. You can see the, the Oregon Land Claims Act, which gave lots of land to white folks if they would improve it within 5 years. But basically, the history is much like the rest of North America: violent land theft, armed removal, forced breakup of families, residential boarding schools, outlawing indigenous religion, bureaucratic policies of extermination, assimilation and racism, rape of the land, terrorism. I won't basically spend a lot of time on this, but everything changed in 1843 when 900 Americans arrived to the Willamette Valley. Before that, there were a lot of Métis, Native American, and French and Canadian Native Americans, Mohawks and others, who were living in what they call over by Champoux, the French prairie. And they all had native wives. There were no white women out here before that. But we don't pay attention to the women, right? We only talk about the men. So there's another injustice. But we had basically most of this land was actually settled by mixed blood Native Americans and whites and Canadians who had native wives. And that is actually the history of Oregon. And actually they got along quite well with the Calipooians at that time. Everything changed between 1844 and 1856. A lot of treaties were forced on the Calipooians and all the Western Oregon Indians. They were all sent under guard to the Grand Ronde Reservation. And then laws began to be passed to keep blacks from entering Oregon, black exclusion laws, anti-Hawaiian laws, anti-Catholic sentiment. And yeah, basically everything changed at that point. But that is not how Oregon began. We do have a racist history, but it wasn't that way in the beginning. There's this correlation between ethnocide and ecocide. At the same time, one Central Oregon early settler claimed he had killed over 100 deer in one day. John McLaughlin, who I'm sure you all know, the director of Fort Vancouver and the Hudson's Bay Company for the Pacific Northwest, I've never seen an Indian kill more game than he needed, and I've never seen a white man stop killing while there was still game left to kill. This is just a really sad statement. Chemawa Indian Boarding School was there, and I won't even get into that, but it was basically, we talk about the children that are put in cages now and are dying and suffering sexual abuse and physical abuse and everything else. And this is nothing new in our country. It happened to our native children. The negotiation was really not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. And all the Calipooians wanted to do was to be left on their land, but they wouldn't do it. These past realities are not just in the past, they're also our present realities. These kinds of things happen still today in different ways. Here's the military invading Standing Rock, and there's always been this ethic of sharing, almost always with Native American people with others. We have our own story, which I won't get into a lot of detail, but Before, we had Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth Justice. In Kentucky, we had Eloheh Village in Cherokee country, and a number of families living there, the same kinds of things going on, happiness all around, and we eventually lost it due to violent pressure from a white supremacist group, paramilitary group with a 50 caliber machine gun, and put our safety in jeopardy. And then we couldn't get any help from any of the officials, both local, state, or federal. And we were doing the similar things: regenerative farming, sweat lodge, talking circle, powwow ceremonies, sobriety circles, education, job training. But it was a threat to white normalcy, because as Indigenous people, we see the world differently, and we call into account those who want to harm Grandmother Earth. This is, I wrote a chapter in this book called Poverty and Poor Among Indigenous North American Traditions. And all the statistics are there. If you want to look it up, it's more or less a reference book. But we lead the world, I'm sorry, we lead the nation in, you know, all the bad things, and, you know, are the lowest for all the, like, education attainment level and all those kinds of things. So all of that has been affected us. There's a lot of reasons for that. You know, but part of that is sort of this strategic plan by the church and state to make us dependent spiritually, physically, economically, to be the poor Indian in need of rescue or admired from a distance as the vanishing race of noble savages. But my argument, and what we argue here at Eloheh, and my wife's argument, is that we can be self-empowering, self-sustaining, and teachers to white American normative society. If we carry intergenerational trauma, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. We think it's in our genes and our DNA. So here's a word by a traditional Cherokee man who was testifying at the Tellico Dam hearings when they were going to they were going to flood all this land, including this village. This was one of my third great grandfather's villages that he lived in. It's called Tellico, and this is a computer reconstruction. It's now underwater. But he said, in the language of my people, there is a word for land, ay-luh-hay. The same word also means history, culture, and religion. We cannot separate our place on the earth from our lives on the earth, nor from our vision, nor our meaning as a people. We are taught from childhood that the animals and even the trees and plants are our brothers and sisters. So when we speak of land, we're not speaking of property, territory, or even a piece of ground upon which our houses sit and our crops are grown. We're speaking of something truly sacred, ay-luh-hay. Indigenous peoples learn naturally from our childhood forward that all things are related to one another. It takes extrinsic learning to create and maintain artificial categories of reality. In time, these categories become realities to the West. This integration occurred in the West as a result of dualisms between such areas as mind and flesh, spirit and body, material and ethereal. The disintegrated worldview has the advantage to be able to concentrate in depth on one category or specifics. So there is some benefit to it. But its deficit is the missing relationship of the extrinsic categories to the whole, to all things. In reality, we are but one community of creation. I believe human beings are not superior to nor subordinate to the rest of creation. A lot of our religions espouse or purport or imply that human beings are the pinnacle of the created order, whether it's reincarnation, evolutionary order, or classic Christianity. Indigenous creation narratives invariably reveal human beings as cooperative partners with the rest of creation, participating with creation in an important role, usually as caretakers. Those indigenous creation narratives, absent of human beings, and there's lots of those, remind us that creation can exist without us. So for my PhD dissertation, I took on a project called the Harmony Way, and I queried a number of elders and different tribes and surveys, and altogether 45 different tribes in this geographic area that you see. And my job was to link these extensive elder interviews and survey responses with the literature regarding Native values and studies, value studies, discourses, and experiences. And as these values emerged, I was able to find, of course, this harmony way and 10 core values that exist within the framework of commonly held among 45 groups across the whole United States and Canada. As a scholar, you're not allowed to say universal, but it's pretty much universal. We integrated all the data into come up with these harmony ways, these 10 values. And I'm not going to read all these in detail, but I've kind of created a truncated version on the next page that I'll show you. But just real quick: tangible spirituality, life is governed by harmony, community is essential, humor is sacred and necessary, cooperative communality, orality, present and past time orientation, open work ethic, hospitality and generosity, and a natural connectedness to all creation. And if you want to boil them down to a little more understandable way, you can just say, like the first one: respect the earth and every living creature, everything and everyone and everything is sacred, highly praxis oriented and symbolic. Harmony, seek harmony and cooperation with nature. Friendship, increase the number and depth of your close friends and family. Laugh at yourself. We're all just human beings. Everyone expressing their voice and decision gives dignity or equality. Authenticity, speak from your heart. Learn from the past, move forward by looking back. Have a balance between work and rest. Share what you have with others, and understand that we're all connected, we're all related, we're all in this together. And those are abridged, but very simply 10 values that I think most people can get behind. And we're all indigenous from somewhere, right? The thing I found out once I began to really delve into this harmony way ethic is that my Maori friends, my Aboriginals, my Zulu, Maasai, Kalahan, Filipino, Hawaiians, all of these people said, oh, we have that too. We have this harmony way. We have this ay-luh-hay in a sense. It's called something different all over the world. But I believe these are humanity's original instructions, and that these are the values that we need to develop and we need to teach, basically the common good. And this is what we do at ay-luh-hay. Besides farm and create a place where we can talk about the land and get people out on the land. And we just moved in here in April. We had lost our farm in Kentucky. We had 50 acres there. It took us about 10 years to recover from that. We bought a small farm in Newburgh, and we had that for, I think, 7 or 8 years. If Edith was in earshot, she would tell me, because she remembers those dates better than I do. And this is my wife, Edith, in these pictures here. We do everything together, except for this academic bit. She doesn't want anything to do with that. She's a very practical person, which I love. And here we are building. I'm digging a root cellar here. We're putting up a deer fence because right away we planted trees and we built some boxes, and we planted vegetables for our seeds and to eat, of course. And the deer started eating us out of house and home, so we had to put up a deer fence. So that's what we're doing there. And this is one of my little granddaughters who's picking blueberries with me here. This is our seed room up in the top left. This is one of our beautiful sunsets. We have the most incredible sunsets out here. There's our boxes. Here they are growing. And Edith does a whole lot of canning every year. Probably puts 300 cans a year back. So our core values are this: the earth and everything on it is sacred. We seek harmony and cooperation with people and nature. In fact, we don't see the difference. We believe community, humor, and story are essential for learning. and that we must all be liberated from a Western worldview. And then this is what's on our webpage here. The reality of the climate crisis requires our urgent response. However, our response should be rooted in learning from those who have long practiced the value for creation and listened to the voice of the Creator in this area. For decades, Randy and Edith Woodley have cultivated ay-luh-hay as a community farm, seed bank, and learning center. For over 30 years, the Woodleys have been teaching Native and non-Native peoples to deepen their commitment to preserving humanity's role as good earth keepers by understanding Creator's invitation to harmony and shalom. Through summits, camps, ceremonies, conferences, and teachings, the Woodleys offer an opportunity for all to learn a new way to live on the land and respond to the climate crisis. And that's pretty much what we're about. We believe that we're all related, and what one of us does affects all the rest of us. I'm just going to kind of, let's see, I don't have the chat up. Charisse, can you come on for a second and tell me what time it is, vocal-wise, because I can't see anything.
You're doing well. It's only 10 till 8, so got 15 more minutes if you want to be done at 7:05 or 8:05.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a couple things we need to realize, and we are closing in on this. Genocide and mass land theft left unreconciled ensures that no peace in the land is possible. This is a wonderful thing about this whole idea of shalom, is that it's like for the whole community. Half of us can't have peace and the other half not have peace. So if we just leave this genocide and mass land theft unreconciled, there can't be peace in the land. It's not going to happen. So hundreds of indigenous nations suffered a similar fate. The Euro-American genocide against Native Americans was planned, calculated, and mythologized, like those of Hitler and Stalin. The perceived problem with Indians was because they held lands others wanted, yet it was considered by natives to be creators' land. Regardless, tens of millions of us were killed and displaced. So we are all direct beneficiaries of this genocide and this theft. And I believe it affects our spirituality and our understanding of life. 2, racism is still a part of societal life, and it shapes our perceptions, discourses, and relatedness. We can't get around it. It's still a part of who we are as a nation and as a state. 3, second peoples, including the churches and other moral, quote unquote, institutions, reside on stolen land. Inarguable fact. 4, initial relationships on the land were based on violence, a violence that still distorts those relationships and continues in various forms, like poverty, lack of education, etc. Environmental racism. Yeah. Number 5, indigenous people and the land continue to be exploited and marginalized in most areas of life. Number 6, communities must determine a social location and understand how it affects their vision and their interests and the interest it continues to protect. So you may not know that Portland is the 11th largest Native American community in the United States. We have over 40,000 Indians, and this is an old figure. There's probably more like 45 now, would be my guess. In addition, Salem Kaiser has over 21,000. The Grand Round has 5,500. So this is Indian country. You live in Indian country. And probably a lot of you are thinking, well, I never see an Indian. It's just because you don't realize who you're seeing. What is our role? My friend Adrian Jacobs says it this way. We are the conscience of your technology. We are the humanizers of your institutions. We are a threat to entrenched powers that be, who refuse to open the doors of opportunity and choice to all. We are a challenge to the mindset of greed, calling for the equitable distribution of resources in the spirit of Jubilee. We are good medicine for you. And then Adrian says, as in any recovery from debilitating social cultural problems, the journey begins with, hello, my name is, I have a problem. I'm proposing that Aboriginal culture, worldview, frame of reference, offers hope to Western peoples. Aboriginal people are not your problem. We are your cure. So the decolonization process is a tough one. It's always messy. But it follows that the antidote will be found in decolonization. To be consciously anti-genocidal and anti-ecocidal, one must be actively anti-imperialist. To be in any way an apologist for colonialism is to be an active proponent for genocide and ecocide. For Americans of European descent, embracing such a project will require a unique process of healing. In the process of healing the wounds left by the sins of the fathers on the backs of indigenous people across the planet, we must simultaneously heal our own wounded spirits. We have healing to do as well. Left unhealed, those wounds condemn us to perpetuate those same sins generation after generation. And then I like this. This is the mess, right? There's a lot of mess to go through to get to where we need to go. But there's a whole lot to gain as well, as you can see. So here's some suggestions towards healing. People often say to me, well, what do we do? And I'm like, well, I don't want us to try and fix it before we understand it, right? But I also want to offer a little bit of maybe like markers along the way that we can look at. What do we need to do with in trying to find a more indigenous worldview, if you will. Adaptability, no longer rigidness. And that has to do with boundaries and openness and all those sorts of things. Intentionality, no longer passive, including financial redistribution, has to be a part of this. Inclusive worship, no longer homogeneous. Education by people of color, no longer white comfort zone. Exploring and embracing diversity narratives, no longer white myths. Racially diverse leadership, sharing power, no longer tokenism. Self-deprecating humor, no longer taking ourselves too seriously. Embodied and empowered churches who are active centers of proactive change. No longer dualistic thinkers where when you think you've done something and you haven't, you actually haven't done anything. And then some structural changes. There are things that we need to do personally and in our communities, but we also need to do structural things. And some of these are just right now, hot buttons. Green New Deal, reimagine police and military, equal access to the vote, supporting local alternative farming and food practices, reimagining urban areas for growing and developing of cooperatives. This is really important. Innovative communities with equal access to the table, like Black and Indigenous farmers. Reimagine churches with reimagined open theologies. Let's get out of the bubble, right? And then here are just a few of the organizations that I think are moving in that direction, who are supporting the rights of the whole community of creation or the rights of Grandmother Earth. Of course, there's us, and then you can see a number of other Center for Earth Ethics. That's Al Gore's daughter's, I'm forgetting her first name right now, organization, Earth Justice, Indigenous Environmental Network, Earth Rights, Global Alliance. The fastest way to end the climate change is to give the Earth rights. And then finally, a new paradigm, something visual for you to see. This is the paradigm that I work from and that my wife and I work from. Awareness, right? And you can get on here anywhere, but awareness and educational process led by Indigenous people in their comfort zone and paid well, which is not often the case. And then lament, public lament, confession, speaking the truth to power, allowing time for that to sink in. And then reparations, or what I call rehumanizing. Reparations are important both with Indigenous people and with African Americans. Restitution first, then relationship building. It's almost always, let's build a relationship and we'll get there. But I think the way that our society is set up so materialistically, that it's like when the materialism goes, when the money goes, then the heart goes after it. So justice initiatives, land initiatives, etc. And then I like to add memorializing. I see that throughout scripture. I think it's important to work together in partnership, retelling the history, codifying the markers. I've seen this happen in a number of cases, and it's worked really well for some communities who memorialize the kinds of things that they were able to do. And finally, end this with this quote from a Shoshone elder: "Do not begrudge the white man for his presence on the land. Though he doesn't know it yet, he's come here to learn from us." And I believe that for many, many, many years. I used to say, well, we've been trying to say something for 500 years. Are you ready to listen? But I think this elder says it better than I do. Maybe if we have time, I'll tell the story of Grandmother Turtle, but basically the story is that we need to listen to the elders. Yeah. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing at this point, and hopefully we can have a great dialogue.
Thank you so much, Randy. I really appreciate what you ended on there with extending grace to those of us who come from European backgrounds. Sometimes we can tend to get stuck in cycles of shame and just feeling like we don't know where to move from here because our ancestors have done all of this. And so I'm really grateful for the extension of grace and of willingness to still teach us, even though we have not been willing learners for so long. So thank you so much for that. Do others have questions for Randy or things that you would like to hear more about?
So this is Peter. Can I go ahead with the question?
Go for it.
So I, for a number of reasons, picked up the Message version, or the Message paraphrase of the Bible, and started reading the Old Testament, and I'm through Chronicles. I wanted to read the histories, basically. And one of the things that occurs to me is the need for really deep reconciliation and conflict resolution, as it seems like there's just a long story of conflict, both internally to the Jewish people and to the peoples they encountered. And I wonder if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Peter, in what way would you like me to speak to that?
I guess I'm looking for indigenous wisdom in terms of conflict resolution and different models for us to look at and grasp and to learn from.
Yeah. So to me, the greatest gift that that our people have, I wish I had it more. My wife has it more than me. A lot of our elders had it more than we can imagine. We've grown up and seen, and that is the ability to speak from our hearts, to tell the truth from our hearts, to be vulnerable, understand our vulnerability as a strength and as a model, so that we can come down to a heart level when we talk, rather than an issue level. Thank you, sweetheart. This is Edith, by the way.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, and she's 100% part of all of this too. I've just got the degree, so I get asked to speak more, and she doesn't like to do this part. So, anyway, this is she's an important part of all of this.
Always welcome to join, though, Edith. We love to hear your voice too.
Thank you,
So I think I think watching elders deal with people who were hostile to them, by them exposing themselves and being vulnerable, disarms people oftentimes, so that they understand that this person actually respects me. This person is giving me room, not trying to take away my dignity, but they're not soft pedaling what's going on either. And so it's that courageous vulnerability that I think the gift of our people have, that can resolve these conflicts. You know, there's lots of division going on, right? And there are truly things that divide us. And yet there's this one thing in common, that we're all human beings, you know? And if we can sort of settle that fact that we're all related, and that what I'm doing to you, I'm doing to myself, and I'm doing to my own family members, that's the worldview that Native Americans bring.
Randy, I know that you've also explored kind of this harmony way in the shalom community in the Hebrew scriptures. And so even though, Peter, I hear you that some of these texts in the Hebrew scriptures are challenging when we see all this conflict and colonization going on as the Israelites are taking over the promised land and stuff like that. There is still something to recover of an indigenous worldview within the Hebrew scriptures, and I really appreciate your work on that, Randy. So I wonder if you'd speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so I started out this journey where I ended up in my PhD wasn't, that's not where I started. I started on something that I was a guide for a Cherokee Trail of Tears, 2 weeks on something called Pilgrimage for Reconciliation with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship Multi-Ethnic Ministries. And one of the things we did the week before was we read the book Shalom, or Peace by Walter Brueggemann. And as we talked about the kind of peace that the shalom is in scripture, I remembered that this is similar to our Cherokee way of thinking. We have a construct. And so I went home that year and I began to talk to elders and other leaders and say, tell me more about this. And well, of course, it's ay-luh-hay. And so as I got deeper and deeper into it, I realized that this ay-luh-hay is very similar to the idea in Hebrew scriptures of shalom. And so, and then of course, my doctoral studies led me to believe that these are the original instructions for all people everywhere, basically. And so, so when we're talking about ay-luh-hay, you can almost or invariably substitute the word shalom, if that's your understanding. And of course, this is the quote unquote, you know, Jesus never used the word kingdom, but this is the kingdom that Jesus talked about. It's a shalom kingdom. It's based on the ancient ideas that were established about justice and about peace and about taking care of the poor and the marginalized, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. All of those, the most marginalized and disenfranchised of society. This is what Jesus was about. This is what his kingdom was about. And this is what he taught. And so if we don't understand this ancient system of shalom, we have no idea what Jesus was really about.
Can you say more about the importance of Jesus never talked about or used the word kingdom?
Well, that's, you know, basilion ton theon, right? That's the Greek. And it just means like really God's reign, or the place where God's in charge. And you know, in the days of King James, they thought kingdom was a pretty good word, you know, because they had a king, right? So that's the one they related to. But I use the term community of creation, because I think if Jesus were to step into human history at this point, he would say, oh, you guys have a totally bifurcated, dualistic worldview, and now you need to bring it back together in this holistic way. Let's say the community of creation is like a net that's thrown out and it brings in old things and new things, you know. So so that's why I use the term community of creation.
Thank you. Do others have questions for Randy?
I have a
You can
question.
feel free to, oh yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So I just jotted down your 4-part model, Randy, of awareness, memorialize, reparations, and lament. And you mentioned that, you know, people could start, you know, wherever they, you know, were prepared to start. But could you give an example of each of how communities have engaged with each of those 4?
Yeah. Well, you know, and there aren't a lot of examples with Indigenous people, unfortunately. It's going from here to here, like they say, that's the farthest 18 inches in the universe. Or maybe I should say going from here to a person's pocketbook is the the farthest distance. But so there's a group. A friend of mine participated with a group in Eastern Washington, Central Washington, Twisp, Washington. Maybe some of you know where that's at. Some of you Washingtonians.
I've been to Twisp.
Okay, so my friend, his name is John Grover. He's also a Cherokee, and he was speaking somewhere, and a group of people approached him and said, you know, we're really bothered about why this whole community is all white and why, you know, all these Indian names of everything. We're the indigenous people, and we heard you were speaking and you're a native, and, you know, and so he said, well, let me introduce you to someone who's from this area, who's a Methal, a hereditary chief. And yes, they were kicked off this land, right? But I can introduce you to the host people of the, and so this couple began to, the original couple began to listen to what this man had to say. Well, pretty soon they said, could we invite another couple? And they said yes. And so, and then he said, I'm going to bring a couple of my friends. And then next thing you know, for 2 years, they just listened. And they heard the story of the Methal people and what had happened, and they watched videos of what has happened to Native Americans, and they just listened, and they said this was a really fragile time. And I would call this both awareness and lament that came out of this. Finally, it got so big that they had to move it into town, out of someone's home in town, and it began a group of about 30, 40 people, and they continued the process for 3 years. Finally, after that, they decided it was time to do something about it. And so they invited the Methal people back to Twisp, to one of their sacred grounds, and they had a big powwow celebration, and friends of mine were at that powwow celebration. And they honored the Native people there, and they gave them gifts, and they ended up, a lot of the ranchers ended up giving them access to their land to hunt roots and things like that, yampa and things. And other people gave things away that were family heirlooms and other things. And then the city of Twisp gave them, I think it was 3/4 of an acre or half an acre in town to build a cultural center on. So now you have awareness and to some degree public lament that was going on. You have restitution that's occurring, and now they memorialized it by building that museum. The original couple are the ones who basically curate that museum. A number of Methal people are on the board of that museum. Methal culture and language and everything is on exhibit at that museum constantly, different exhibits that go through there. And you can read about it. You can go online to the, I don't know what it's called, I've forgotten now, but there's actually a video that was made from that called Two Rivers, and that kind of tells that whole story. It's a beautiful thing. Relationships that will last a lifetime were made from that. But that's one example. But this is not light work, right? This is not, platform reconciliation. This is a lifelong energy put into relationships and building and restitution and all of those things. So, but in the end, it's a visible marker for everyone there to see for generations to come. This is what happened, and this is what is occurred as a result. And I know a couple more stories, but I think I only know 3 stories, so sorry.
Do others have questions?
I do. Randy, I noticed you on your list, you had integrated places of worship. And my question is, who around here is really doing that? There's lots of white churches that want to still do white church and say, oh, but you all are welcome. Why aren't you coming to join us? But I'm talking about the thing that you're talking about. Where do you find that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe Sharice would be a better person to ask than me. I'm pretty much out of church culture for the last 8 years, I think. I still go and speak in churches, but I haven't seen one like the ones I'm describing. But I know there are things going on. I know there's good things going on. I keep hearing people tell me there are. But you know, we're still not at a place where, and I think the reason for that, David, is because I think a lot of the white churches still have the idea that white normalcy is human normalcy. And so if you disturb that normalcy, there's something wrong with you, rather than saying, we have a problem and it's called white normalcy. And the only way for us to get a cure is to honor and invite other people and us listen, sort of an idea. So I think that's my assessment anyway.
I have
and
a
of course,
question.
it doesn't, let me just finish up on that. I was traveling on Amtrak one time, and they set you at the table with people, you know, and you never know who you're going to sit with. And so I was talking to this older couple, and they were telling me they just came back from a Christian Missionary Alliance meeting, and it was all about diversity. No, I'm sorry, Covenant Church, about diversity. And as I start talking to her, she goes, oh, we read your book when I was there. It was the Living in Color book, the original about diversity. And and then her husband tells me, and he's a Iowa farmer, and he says, I don't go for all that. You know, I'm not going to change blah, blah, blah. You know, I don't want to, I like my songs. I like to hear them. I like, you know, and I said, well, is there another church, people of color in town? Yeah, we have Black church. I said, would it be too much if once a quarter you went to their church or they came to your church and you joined worship and you all ate together? And he said, oh no, I could do that. And I said, well, you know, that's a start. So yeah, there's lots of ways to do things.
I think as far as people trying to do something integrated, the community that I know of as far as working on this in Native traditions and Christianity in Oregon is the Great Spirit United Methodist Church. And so that's one that I think is experimenting with this work and trying to do that work.
So I had a question, and thank you, Randy, for the great presentation. So we really seem to be at a portal right now here in our society, an opportunity to change, and we have so much coming together right now in terms of climate action, in terms of the Me Too movement, in terms of Black Lives Matter, and yet I think it seems to me that the Indigenous voice is not prominent yet. What are your thoughts on that? And as far as raising up the Indigenous voice and making sure that when we make change, the changes we make address including Indigenous peoples as well.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think it's unfortunate. I think you have to, if that's what you want, you have to seek out Indigenous people, because, you know, we've been conditioned to realize that we need to stay out of things except for our own business, because we're not wanted there. And there's a reason we're called the invisible minority. And there's a lot of cultural things as well. And then there's a whole lot of conditioned things, like, you know, the whole idea of church and state has been to create a dependency of Native people, both spiritually and economically. And so, you know, you don't want to lose that dependency, right? So, so there's a whole lot of things that fly against that. But at the same time, it's really important to have Indigenous people's voices there at the table. And I would say, and, you know, I don't want to say that for me, but I want to say it for other people wiser than me, that they should be leading the discussion and they should be at the head of the table. So. And that's what the grandmother turtle story is about. I'm just going to really quick tell you, you know, what happens is the grandmother turtle is meeting with all the other animals because they've run out of land, right? And so, and animals were a lot bigger back in that day too. So they go to the creator and they say, we need more land. And creator thinks to creator self, if I just give them land, they won't appreciate it. So creator says, if you dive down to the bottom of the water, because they were on this little island, if you dive down to the bottom of the water and you bring up mud, I'll take that mud and I'll spread it across and I'll make a lot of land for you and your descendants. So the animals have a conversation, and I'm not doing this justice because I'm going to go through this really quick because I know I want more questions if you have them. But first, grandmother turtle volunteers to go, and they just say, grandmother turtle, you're too old and you're too slow. And so the first one to volunteer to go is the duck. Well, the duck gets out, and the duck doesn't dive very well. The duck just goes down and pops back up, and the duck comes swimming back, and they say, okay, well, let's somebody else do it. And so grandmother turtle again says, you know, I'll go get the mud. And they say, grandmother turtle, you're too old, you're too slow, you know, we'll find somebody else to do it. And so they try and get Otter to go do it. Well, Otter goes down and he's gone for all this time, and he comes back and he forgets, you know, what he's even there for. He starts chasing the fish and he can't even remember what they're talking about half the time. So they're like, okay, who could go now? Grandmother turtle says, I'll go get the mud. Finally, Beaver steps up and says, look, you know, I don't play, I only work, you know, and I don't even eat fish, so I don't, you know, have to worry about that. I'll go get the mud. Beaver comes back after 3 days and says, it's impossible. It's too far down. Nobody can do it. Grandmother turtle just goes through the crowd. She doesn't say a word, and she's gone. And she's gone for 6 days. And on the 7th day, they're all watching, and she floats back up to the top. And they look, and she's dead. And so, you know, they send Otter and Beaver and Duck out to get grandmother turtle. They bring her back, and they're all crying, and they're sad. They're sad because grandma turtle died doing this, and they're sad because, you know, they can't have any more land. And then all of a sudden, someone says, "Oh, look in grandma turtle's claw," and they pull out, and there's this little ball of mud there, right? And so, so they take that mud to the creator. And creator takes and spreads it all out and creates, in honor of grandma turtle, calls it Turtle Island. This is one of our Cherokee stories, by the way. And that's this North America that we're on today. And I often, when I tell that story, I'll ask people, you know, hey, what do you think that story's about? You know, and but a little Indian kid answered that the best one time. A little Indian boy, and he said they should have listened to their elder to begin with, and that's what I think. You know, our people have been on this land. The Kalapuyan people have been here for at least 14,000 years. They know a little bit more They have a lot more experienced wisdom and understanding than most of us settlers who are here. They're the ones that need to be listened to. So.
Randy, my name's Harriet. That was a beautiful story. Beautiful story. And I've always been enchanted by Native American stories. I'm honored that you lift up the Hebrew word shalom. And my history. And I struggle with my story. I struggle deeply with the Old Testament story because it is a story of taking over other people's lands. It's a story of massacres in order to get other people's land. And so I'm wondering how you reconcile that part of the story.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And of course, anybody who's going to seminary should ask that question at some point in their career as well. So I've answered that a number of times in different ways. But basically, the problem to me occurs with the understanding of the Western world and how they interpret story. So no one who wrote the scriptures wrote them from a post-Enlightenment worldview. What's a post-Enlightenment worldview? Well, it has to do with sort of, material, the things that are generated of the mind are more important, like theologies and, scriptures and those kinds of things. But the truth is that the scriptures are actually 90% story. And if you don't understand how indigenous, and I would say this Hebraic worldview is closer to indigenous, much closer than Enlightenment, interpret stories and what the purpose of story is, you're going to take that and go, oh, is this fact or not? Well, in our indigenous worldview, it doesn't even matter if it's fact. What's the point of it being fact? We don't need to prove it's fact or not fact. That's not even a question that comes up. What's important is what is true in that story. Just because it's fact doesn't mean it's true. Or just because it's not fact doesn't mean it's true. So what's true in that story for me is what the storyteller told that story for. Why did they tell that story? What were they trying to teach? And if we begin to understand story in a different way, then we understand, like, it's all there. It's human life. It's not a book just about conquest. It's a book about the good, the bad, the ugly. There's lots of good there too. All of those are stories that we're supposed to understand as truth, but not as fact. Does that make sense?
Quite frankly, no.
Okay.
But it was a good try. The best I can do with that is when I, read the rest of the writings in the Old Testament after the Torah story, we see that the fighting continues. There never is a promised land because the fighting never stops. So what I get from that story is, this is how we did it. This is what happened. This doesn't work.
Yeah.
So,
And that is one way to understand it. It's a militaristic way. Of course, Jesus didn't understand it that way. And so as someone who's a follower of Jesus, I looked through that lens first to understand what history was about. And so when Jesus comes up to, like on Luke 4, for example, which is where he begins to speak at the synagogue and he announces who he is and what his purpose is and all those kinds of things, he ends up taking a different view of history than the people who were there in his hometown. And what he says is, you know what? Creator has been involved in the lives of widows, even at a time when Creator wasn't involved in the lives of widows in Egypt. But there was a widow of Zarephath who God takes care of. And there was this foreigner, this Roman or this Syrian centurion named Naaman, and Elisha was sent to him, and 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 God heals that person. And so they want to throw him off a cliff after that, a cliff. They're like, you know, don't say that to us, we're going to kill you. Well, why? Because they understood that, you know, they wanted God to be like they are, ethnocentric, militaristic, all of those kinds of things. And Jesus said, that's not who God is.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I that's the lens that I like to look at the rest of Scripture through. And when I see something that doesn't match the ethic of what Jesus taught, the vulnerability, the kindness, the love, even the love for your enemies, then I say, you know, there's something wrong with that story if I believe that's the right way to act.
Yes. Thank you. I too believe that Rabbi Jesus came to lift up the story to an evolution of the human brain and the soul. So thank you.
Yeah. But I would say that it's based in that ancient idea of shalom, you know, the shalom, what I call the Sabbath shalom jubilee construct, which is all about taking care of those who can't take care of themselves. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it seems like recent generations of Jewish folks have come to a similar conclusion too, as far as the main thrust of who God is and how God is inviting us into shalom community through the idea of tikkun olam, of restoring the world and repairing the world. And so I appreciate that phrase from Judaism too, and that the Jewish community is bringing to interfaith work to say our work is repairing the damage that we have caused through all of our faith communities, reading these texts through an imperialist lens instead of seeing the indigenous wisdom that is there present in the text, calling us to build shalom communities.
Yeah. By the way, since we mentioned the Luke 4, I need to conclude with this. The storyteller in Luke 4 is telling us something else. How do we know if there is shalom? We know it if the widows, the orphans, and the immigrants are being taken care of, because those are the people who can't take care of themselves in a patriarchal agricultural society, right? So they don't have buy-in. And so those are what I call this holy triad that's mentioned throughout the scriptures and with the prophets, et cetera, et cetera. And so the storyteller is telling us there was a widow that God took care of, but you don't care about. There was an immigrant, a foreigner, who God took care of, but you don't care about. And the only thing that's missing from that story is the orphan. And what the storyteller is trying to tell us, Jesus was at his hometown and they tried to kill him. He was the orphan.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a beautiful reminder for us, and good for us to be drawn back to the heart of the work that is before us all. And so thank you so much for sharing with us, Randy, and helping us to decolonize our worldviews and our faith traditions. It's a lot of rearranging of our mental ways of looking at things and our ability to interpret our scriptures in healthier ways. So thank you for giving us a window into that and being an ongoing source of helping us through that in my experience and in the experience of many of us on this call. So I appreciate your sharing with us tonight.
Thank you, Sharice. Appreciate the invitation. And you seem like lovely people, and you're welcome to email me if you have further questions or dialogue that you want to engage in. I'm always happy to do that. So thanks for allowing me to be here tonight.
And we have 2 more webinars in this series, and then we also have a season of creation event coming up on October 4 that I hope you'll put on your calendars and join us for. And we'll send you out information about Randy's learning cohort that's coming up starting at the end of September if you're on EMO's mailing list. So thank you for being here tonight, and we will send out communications about all of those great things coming up shortly. Have a good evening, everyone.